I'm really excited to be here, and I'm grateful for this opportunity to talk to y'all. I'm doing a different format. I didn't print it out word for word because I didn't want to read from sheets of paper to you. So there might be some spontaneity involved in this. We'll see what happens. But I'm grateful to be here. I'm particularly grateful that we're at the University of South Wales Trinity St. David, University of Wales Trinity St. David campus, because I owe them a lot in terms of my interests in academia and my first foray into research. But I'll tell you a bit more about that in a minute. What I'll do is I'll tell you just a little bit about me, some anecdotal background stuff that ties in directly to what I'm going to be talking about today. But before I get started, I want to ask you a question. If you were a teacher in a school, or if you're teaching now in any institution, what is your top priority as a teacher? If you had to summarize it, what is your top priority as an educator? That was a question that, when I started on my journey into teaching, I thought I could answer quite simply. And as now that I look back, it's 15 years now that I've been in education, and as I look back now, I can see that it's a deceptive kind of question, really, because what we think might be our purpose might be an immediate purpose, it might be a long-standing purpose, it might be something that we think is a purpose, but we're actually not aligned to that purpose, and we're working towards other goals, and we have other motivations. So I was born in northern Utah. I don't know if you're familiar with Utah, but it's quite a distinctive place. Geographically amazing, beautiful, but also in a lot of ways very separated from the rest of the world. And as a young child, I loved learning. I didn't love school per se, but I did want to be a teacher, and I had this desire to teach, and didn't know exactly, as a young person, what that was about. And even through primary school and through secondary school, that remained. Now, what was funny is that my trajectory didn't take me into teaching right off the bat. I actually did 13 years in marketing and business development. And so there was a point in my life, though, where I was feeling the sense of existential ennui. I don't know what it was. But what had happened was my wife and I were married at a very young age. I was 19, she was 17. We were married the day after she graduated from high school. Didn't help that we were also 5 months pregnant, but that was the situation. In fact, I remember her mom had to come to the courthouse and sign her over to me because it was illegal for her to marry me without parents' consent. So that was kind of the start of our life together. And I'm happy to say that we celebrated our 29th wedding anniversary in this May. So we've been making a go of it. And it seems to be working okay so far. But what that did is that kind of set our trajectories in ways that we didn't anticipate. And so the idea of me teaching, whatever that idea was, didn't manifest itself right away. And I went through all of this working in the private sector and stuff like that, and didn't realize that in the heart of me, I'm, a syndical anarchist, that I'm very left-wing Marxist kind of ideas about things. I wasn't a very good capitalist. And so I had a lot of questions, a lot of unhappiness, unfulfilled. I didn't feel like I had the meaning and the purpose in life that I was going for. And on the other hand, too, is my Vitaly Dod and Gymru and Ryddiol, right? My family's from Wales originally. And I was raised with this tales of this wonderful country full of castles and dragons. And I thought it was amazing, right? And my grandparents would call me, and I'd speak to them on the phones with their, incomprehensible Valleys accents and think, gosh, who are these people and stuff. So I had a sense of hiraeth without actually living in Wales. I had a sense of Cynefin, although I wasn't personally located in Wales. So I had a feeling of longing and wanting to belong, and a feeling of being associated to Welsh identity. So I wanted to move to Wales. And so here I am in a good job in northern Utah, high school diploma, people telling me I should go back to university, not really believing them. I actually tried university when I was young, and right after I got married, and I did a couple semesters and was just not doing well. So I told my wife I'd take a semester off, and that semester turned into 12 years. Who would have thought? So in the moment when I was thinking about what I should do next, my wife said, it's not your vocation, it's your location. I'm kind of rambling now, but so what happened was in 2001 I decided I'm going to quit my job and we're going to pick up sticks. We're going to get some interviews set up in the UK and Cardiff, and we're going to make it happen. And I flew out on September 10th of 2001, and as I was flying over the country, the pilot said, there's weather in New York, we can't go to New York, you're going to have to stay over in Ohio, and we'll fly you out on the 11th. And so here I am at Cincinnati, Ohio airport, bags in hand on September 11th, and everything happened on that day, as you can imagine. So I'm stranded in the airport for 3 days, and I had to stop and think now, okay, what is the goal here? How are we going to respond to this? And that's when my wife and I had a serious conversation about going back to university and to become a teacher. And to think, really, what did I want in life? And so I thought, well, maybe it's not teaching. Maybe it's about teaching people about teaching. Maybe it's just about our general association with being in education. And we came up with a plan. I'd go back to university. She'd put me through uni. I'd do my bachelor's, my master's, and my PhD back to back. And that would give us all the options that we needed if we wanted to move, if we wanted to get into teaching, whatever we wanted to do. That was the idea. So during that experience, it worked, yay. And after I finished my bachelor's degree, my first teaching job was in an inner city school in Cincinnati, Ohio. And to give you an idea, not to over-sensationalize the environment, but like during my first week as a teacher, during my very first day, I had a student, as they call it, they were strutting on you, came right up to me and was really physical with me and just didn't want to be in the classroom. And I was given some very bad advice that when you're in that situation, you need to talk tough and establish your credibility with the students. And so I kicked him out of class, and he never came back to school. Like, not just my class, but he never came back to school. So that possibly, if you ever get bad advice, I say that was my worst piece of advice, was playing tough with that kid. The few days later, I was consoling a 15-year-old young woman who was being told to get an abortion by her boyfriend, but being told, on the other hand, to have the baby by her mother, who was proud of her for finally coming into motherhood, and me not being able to make sense out of that. I recovered my first gun off a student during that week. And so you can imagine, coming from northern Utah that's relatively cut off from the rest of the world, and now moving into this space and teaching in this space, it changed my ideas about what I thought my purpose was as a teacher. And in fact, I was also reading quite a bit at the time, because I was doing my master's program at the time. So I'm reading Paulo Freire, Nell Noddings, Ivan Illich, Michael Apple, Henry Giroux, Cameron McCarthy, Bill Pinar, Bill Reynolds, Joe Kinchlow, Antonio Dario. You get the idea, right? So that started to change also my ideas about what I felt my purpose was. But what was cool about that was as I was doing my practice, I found ways to connect what I was reading, what I was doing, with what I was actually doing with my pupils in school. And I talked to my colleagues about it, and a lot of them would challenge me. Because on the first day of school, one of the veteran teachers came up to me and he says, you're the bright-eyed teacher they just hired. And I said, yeah. And he goes, you're going to really touch those lives. And I was like, well, yeah, maybe. He's like, they're just hillbillies with afros. So on one hand, I've got this kind of colleagues, and on the other hand, I've got people that were really enriching my experience. So a funny thing about that was as I started to connect with purpose and an idea of what my pedagogy might do for me and my students, it had also unintended consequences. So, for instance, this school was on what we call a Superfund site in an industrial area. A lot of empty factories, a lot of chemical spots where there's signs everywhere, don't go. And I thought, gosh, this reminds me a lot of some of the Valley's environments where my family's from. So BBC had an episode, or a film they put on called Aberfan. And what they did was they showed what happened when the tip fell and how the local community responded to it, went to the National Coal Board. It was a very politically active environment. And I was in a classroom where I was given a textbook. I was an ICT teacher. And I was given a textbook for how to teach Microsoft applications. That is not the most exciting thing to teach in the world. And we'd open up to page 5 in Excel, and it would say, tell the students to pretend that they're the CEO in a widget company, and they have to they have to inventory their widgets. So open up your spreadsheet. Can you imagine? And all the students, they just really resisted that because it was meaningless. It was a meaningless exercise. And so I said, well, maybe if we flip the curriculum a bit and we use the standards, because it was a standards-based curriculum at the time, and we look at formatting documents and understanding how workbooks work and cell referencing, those types of things, I can use those as a means to an end. And the end was to create maybe more engaged, more personalized, real kind of work. So there were political discussions about whether we should be smoking in public spaces or not, whether gay marriage should be allowed or not, those types of things. And so at a local level, when they were talking about should we be smoking in public spaces, I had the students talk about it in class, because a lot of them smoke. And then also, and their parents smoked. And then they wrote letters to the local council saying, here's my position on this, what is your position on this? We formatted documents and put posters around the school. I tried to make it as much as a socially active kind of curriculum as possible. And then I showed them the Abrevon video, and so they could see that that kind of local political action can have a difference. That was on Thursday. Friday, things were kind of quiet. Monday, come back into work. No one's in my classroom at the beginning of the day. And so I'm sitting there thinking, this is odd. Was there an assembly or something I don't know about? The teacher comes in, you better go downstairs. So I go downstairs, and in the corridor are all my students lined up on the floor with some others. And I said, what are you guys doing? And they said, well, we're doing what you told us to do. And I was like, what's that? And we're having a protest. And I was like thinking back to my notes. I did not tell them this is to have a protest. But they were supposed to have a student representation on the Board of Governors, and they weren't given it. That wasn't being recognized. They asked for it, wasn't being recognized. They decided, based on this kind of social action stuff I'd been doing, that they had rights and needed to express this. So I supported it. And it was great. And they'd come upstairs and they'd say, Mr. Hubbard, the head teacher, he says that he's going to mark us truant because we're not in our classroom. And I said, well, the school policy says you just have to be on school grounds. Go remind Mr. Hubbard this. Come back up again. Mr. Hubbard says he's not going to feed us lunch. And I said, well, remind Mr. Hubbard, this is a Title I school. We have 100% free school meals. And if he doesn't provide you with that free school meal, he could lose his funding. And they go back down. And eventually, they won, which was great. And my contract didn't get renewed the next year. And so that's when I came to University, to Trinity, St. David, and I did an international teaching fellowship with them. So I had to tie that in somehow. My next teaching experience, though, when I came back from Trinity, was teaching at the 5th ranked school in Ohio. And if you want to talk about like 180 degrees, because where this school, this is in 2009, and the average income for the community was $88,000, so about 67,000 pounds. 90% white, congressmen, congresspeople's kids, footballers' kids. I had a year 7 student, pupil who had a personal shopper. Her dad was a food engineer. He contributed to Lay's and baked Lay's and Pepsi Max and stuff like that. And she had a personal shopper, and her monthly budget was my house payment. And so I went from this one environment where I had a very specific set of ideas and purposes, and I was deriving a lot of what I felt was significant meaning from this interaction, into another environment, but seeing a lot of really similar issues. I think a lot of people wear working in inner city schools as kind of a badge, and it is difficult, it is important, but it's not to discount the problems that are existing in more affluent schools, because there was still suicide, there was still drug abuse, there was still bullying, there's still a lot of different problems that we have. We have problems in all schools. They're just kind of organized differently based on setting. So during that whole time, I'm doing my master's, I'm doing my PhD, and I came to realize that for me, how I envisioned education, how I envisioned schooling, how I envisioned teaching, was not what I thought at all. And that the purposes and the meaning I was deriving from those largely depended on my context, but also upon what was I consuming at the time, and what was I doing with what I was consuming. And so I had an amazing couple of professors, Dennis Carlson and Richard Quantz, who were always like, Kevin, you got to ask more questions. Think more about stuff. What is education? What is this? And so they always challenged me and I enjoy those kinds of things. And so for me, I thought I can get a purpose for education, I can get a purpose for schooling, and then I don't think maybe schooling is schooling after all, I think maybe schooling is training. So for me, education is just liberation from ignorance. And that's a very broad thing, and almost a lot of people say, that's so broad it's not useful. But for me it's useful because we're all ignorant to some degree. And so education is just moving us along from one level of ignorance to a lesser level of that. And schooling, of course, is just the organization of those kinds of activities for a specific purpose around a specific body of knowledge for particular reasons. But training, for me, focuses more on the skills, on tasks, on jobs. And so training can happen within a school, and training can be part of education, but maybe too often we conflate schooling and training or education and training. And I think when we do that, then we also minimize and limit what we can do in terms of understanding purpose and finding meaning in what we do. So when I came to Wales, okay, so I left that school as well, finished my PhD, I applied for some jobs. I put 73 job applications out. I got 3 interviews. Or 2 interviews, and I accepted one of the interviews, and we went and lived in Tonga for 2 years. And the job was fantastic. I worked with 11 Pacific Island nations in developing educational policy, and it was great in a lot of ways. But I always wanted to come to Wales, and I had to actually go to Tonga to come to Wales. Long story, I won't go there. So I come to Wales in 2013 to start as the kind of the lead researcher on this multi-cohort study that was put together by the Wales Institute of Social and Economic Research Data and Methods, otherwise known as WIZARD. What this is a longitudinal study that has primary and secondary school pupils in it. We also included some teachers. They were organized into 4 cohorts originally. And every year we went out to these schools and we surveyed the pupils on a number of different constructs, a number of different concepts. We also did focus groups and interviews on some things. And so we've had some really interesting papers come out of this. For instance, we found out that 25% of pupils in Wales wake up in the middle of the night to text each other, so they don't sleep very well. We found out that curriculum initiatives, like the Curriculum Cymraeg, for instance, weren't very well understood, and therefore it undermined the effectiveness of the policy. Same thing with the foundation phase. We're being able to recognize certain issues with how it's been rolled out and supported. But we also asked teachers certain questions. So we had 216 teachers. These were teachers that were in the classroom as well as head teachers and teachers with added responsibilities. And what we did was we asked them, what is your top priority as a teacher? And so we had 175 responses from that. Now, just in terms of limitations, I know it's difficult to say, if someone asks you a question, what is your purpose or priority as a teacher? These might not be necessarily comprehensive or representative of that. So some people, because they're filling out a survey, they might just give a curt answer. However, we did have some people who gave detailed answers. And so where some people might give a curt answer and some people might give a more detailed answer, some people also might have thought, how do I take my idea and encapsulate it down into a very succinct response? And so I think there is a spectrum there of types of responses. That said, at least I think this can give us an indication about how these teachers that we're surveying are understanding what their priorities are. So you can see we have 3 very broad categories. They focused on teaching, they focused on pupils, and they focused on achieving potential. More than 1 out of 5 teachers talked about achieving potential, which I think a lot of people are like, that's fantastic. We want teachers to want pupils to strive to achieve their potential. But I think it's bullshit, personally, because it brings up a lot of questions then. So when we break it down into smaller categories, if we talk about pupils in general, they talked about the pupils' personal development, preparing the pupils for adulthood, qualifications, giving the pupils qualifications, the pupils' well-being, that the pupils enjoyed learning. Academics was progression and learning in the lesson or progressing through the school. And then, of course, teaching. And then, of course, there's achieved potential. This right here, the 4.4%, those responses were literally the pupils or the children. Okay, so responses like that kind of gave me pause, and that's why I started thinking, well, now, what if we looked at it a little bit more closely? Now, the reason why I don't like achieve potential, there's a lot of reasons for this. For instance, what is potential? What do we mean by potential? What do we mean by achieving that potential? Do all pupils possess the same amount or type of potential? Is potential a singular quality, or does it have varied embodiments, performances, applications, trajectories? Is it possible to achieve our full potential? What about a portion of our potential? How do we know the difference? In order to accomplish achieving potential, we have to put a limit on the pupil's potential. Because how can you achieve something if you don't know whether you've hit that benchmark? So how can we reach it if there's no goal or terminus? What happens when we reach that aim? Can you imagine if you're striving as a teacher to help pupils achieve their potential and you're in the middle of a great lesson, all of a sudden the people in the back raise their hand and goes, "Miss, I think I just achieved my potential." Where do you go from there? And what becomes of people who achieve their potential? For me, I think in a lot of ways, that's a horrible experience. You've achieved your potential. What then happens? You ain't got nothing left. So, is it desirable then to achieve our full potential? The other thing, though, is how do we measure it? What instruments will we use? What are the units of analysis? What's the method? And what are the theories that inform these methods? Help pupils achieve their full potential, I think, is what people say when they don't know what else to say. Because maybe they haven't been given the opportunities, or maybe they've had experiences that have not granted them the ability to carefully think about what it is they're doing in the classroom with young people. So if we look at the responses from teachers, you can see 19.4% of the teachers talked about them as a teacher and their practice. Most of the responses were things like this: raising standards. It tells you a lot about what their assumptions then are about the current qualities of education in Wales. Survival against accountability, not to have a failed inspection. So we talk also about the realities of being a teacher in a high accountability system. Again, this to do my best, that's a lot like achieving potential, but this time it's on the teacher. The teacher wants to achieve their potential. To teach well, excellent, and to enable the pupils to learn effectively. All admirable aims, but again, how are we going to get down to the nitty-gritty and understand if that's really what we're doing or not? And then to always give my best, that's kind of a potential, and treat all children equally so they have the same opportunities. The other category, qualifications. Because of my orientation to schooling, this makes me the saddest. Examination results for pupils, best possible outcomes. External exam results. They're all very just on-off, black and white kind of responses, but I do like this one. To make sure pupils leave me at the end of year 11 with options for the future, qualifications to support this, and they feel school has been safe. I thought the safe thing was kind of an odd tag at the end, but that's fine. But you can see, though, that with this person here, options for the future rely on qualifications. I think maybe we over-rely on qualifications. The big pupils block this, and these are the subcategories for it. So when we talk about academics, they're talking about how they progress through each section here, through a key stage, for instance. We have preparing pupils for adulthood. A lot of that was preparing them for the real world, because somehow school wasn't the real world, or life outside of school. A lot of it was preparing them for jobs. This one I thought was interesting, to develop pupil aspiration for the future. There tends to be a large myth out there that particularly pupils in the valleys lack aspiration, but there's been two pieces of research recently done by researchers in Wales that showed that that's absolutely not the case. But what we find is that the aspirations that these young people are clinging to and performing and talking about they're quite different. And so on one hand, you've got kids that are saying they want to be footballers and they want to be YouTube stars and they want to be influencers. And people look at that and go, well, that's not a career. But, it is for some folks. And can we allow those aspirations now to take root, or do we continue to challenge and critique them? Hard to say. Also, there's a concern that pupils should enjoy learning. These things will become a little bit more interesting as I show you some other factors here. But as you can see, they talk a lot about making sure that they're learning in terms of that particular lesson But then a lot of people talked about this idea that that people should enjoy learning as a lifelong learning throughout the rest of their life. Quite admirable. Personal development. So what we did was we took all those responses and we organized them by whether they were members of the senior management team, whether they were teachers with added responsibilities, or whether they're classroom teachers without responsibilities. So these are like head of department, head of year, those types of things. You can see that this achieving potential runs pretty standard throughout. But what we don't find, for instance, is that in terms of top priorities, the head teachers never brought up qualifications as one of their top priorities in our sample. And I'll veer a lot into speculation here, because this is just the data we have right now, but that could be perhaps because they're delegating the responsibility of the qualification results to the teachers themselves who are at the chalk face. So we can see, though, that here, when we look at personal development, the head teachers are talking in larger macro terms about the students, larger, conceptual terms. They want them to be good people, for instance. They want to help them progress into adulthood. They're not so concerned. I think the funny thing about here is you can see the teachers are far less concerned about the pupils enjoying learning than the head teacher, for instance. It's kind of funny to me. And then it seems like the head teachers, their top priority for pupil well-being is far less, 1/3 of that of the classroom teachers. And of course, that probably talks about the interpersonal relationships between the teachers and the pupils in the room. That's kind of interesting. But I think the story that really should be told is this. So then we organized the responses. We took the schools that were in areas that were above the national average for free school meals in Wales, and the schools that were below that. So if you're below the national average, you're a more affluent school. If you're above the national average, you're a less affluent school, or a disadvantaged school. Achieve potential is holding on to its 20% roughly. And then you can see that in schools that are more affluent, we have almost 3 times as many of the priorities by teachers focusing on preparing their pupils for adulthood. In a less affluent school, we can see teachers are more concerned with the pupils enjoying learning. Both of them are pretty close to progression and academic progression. We can see here that personal development is a little bit stronger in the less affluent schools. And look at well-being, though. It's 3 times as high, 3 times as many of the teachers, in terms of their priority, were focusing on pupil well-being in the more affluent schools. There's a slightly stronger emphasis on qualifications, but look at the emphasis on the quality of teaching. Teachers are far more concerned about them raising standards, doing their best as a teacher, teaching their content area. One teacher said that my priority is to teach my content, my curriculum content. Okay, that's fine, but at least they're concerned with the quality of their teaching. But you can see it's twice as strong in the less affluent schools. Does that change when we focus on primary and secondary school? If we look at just the primary schools, now these are 100% stacked bars. So what I'm doing is showing you how each of these themes contribute to the whole. Now, what I forgot to mention earlier was that these were coded multiple times, and the intercode reliability is a Scots Pi's 0.87, so we felt pretty confident that we were on the same page there. And these themes, we called them inductive themes, that we hoped captured what the responses were telling us. So in the primary school, in the less affluent areas, you can still see that big focus on teaching quality. You can still see a big difference between the priorities of well-being. So in the more affluent schools, a bigger emphasis on well-being, a larger emphasis on enjoying learning, a bigger emphasis on preparing pupils for adulthood. They didn't even talk about preparing the less affluent children for adulthood in their priorities for the high efficacy schools. But also then, what I think is this kind of stultifying focus on potential. And I'm wondering, what is this? Why is this so high here in these schools? It's still pretty high here, but it's inordinately high there. And, again, speculation. Maybe they think that these pupils have more potential, or maybe these people up here are focusing more on concrete aims because they're in a less affluent school, we just don't know yet. In terms of secondary schools, you can see there's less difference. And there's, of course, you're not going to see primary schools talking about qualifications. But here in secondary schools, it pops up. And these things mirror each other more closely. But you do see that in the less affluent schools, there's a bigger emphasis on personal development still, and a smaller emphasis on pupil well-being. Interesting here, though, that as we get into secondary school, it's the more affluent schools that maintain their focus on the quality of teaching. And that might, again, have a relationship with the faith that we put in qualifications. Now, this one is just to kind of give you where you can compare the two high FSM, low FSM things together. But remember, there's 84 below average school, 91 below average schools and 84 above average, so there's going to be a slight difference in how they contribute. But you can see that if you're in a more affluent school, you're going to be focusing on preparing people for the future more. You're going to be focusing on people's well-being more, and there's a slight focus on qualifications in the secondary schools. So what, right? So what? Well, I feel like a lot of times what this is telling me is that maybe we're sending the wrong messages about what our purpose is in education. As teachers, how can we find purpose? How can we derive more meaning from what we do? And so in Wales, we have I'll tell you some anecdotal experience. So I teach in the professional doctorate and on master's classes with teachers. And when they come in, my favorite module is one about Dewey. We look at experience in education, a 360-degree view on Dewey. And I bring the teachers in. There's going to be 30 or 40 of them there. And they've heard of progressive education, but they've never read Dewey. When we ask them about experiential education, they talk about learning by doing, and they talk about forest school. But they are sublimely unaware of Dewey's attempt to reconcile realist and relativist epistemological tension through a pragmatic philosophy of learning as a sociocultural experience. I mean, they don't understand chapters 2 and 3 of Experience in Education, for instance. And that's not to say that it's correct, but Dewey was talking about a philosophical approach, not a cognitive science understanding of learning. So when we talk about Freire, they've heard of Paulo Freire, because they've heard from folks like Tom Bennett and Sam Friedman and Daisy Christodoulou, who talk about Freire in very particular ways. They're not familiar with critical pedagogy. They've heard of the banking model of education, but they don't, and they think he's talking about all, quote, unquote, traditional schooling, but they don't understand that what Freire is talking about is not a specific, he's talking about a specific type of traditional schooling, a specific event that happens where it limits or subdues one's ability to develop conscientization or the critical disposition necessary to perceive our social reality as subject to transformation. Where Dewey's purpose of education is life, is about living life pragmatically now in the moment. And that has dimensions to it, has democratic dimensions to it, has sociocultural dimensions to it. Paulo Freire is arguing for education as a liberative practice, that oppression meant something very specific to him. And so teachers will hear Dewey and Freire and apply it to their context and not understand that they're talking about specific philosophical arguments. In the curriculum for Wales, we have the 4 purposes. And the 4 purposes are suspiciously similar to the 4 capacities in Scotland. So the 4 purposes are ambitious, capable learners who are ready to learn throughout their lives. But again, how do we assess ambition and capability? Enterprising, creative contributors who are ready to play a full part in life and work. But what is a full part in life and work? What assumptions are being made about the quality of life and the expectations of pupils? Ethical, informed citizens who are ready to be citizens of Wales and the world, but aren't most pupils attending school citizens? And what do we mean by ethical? And what do we mean by an informed? Or what is citizenship in Wales? What is the model we're talking about here? The last one is healthy, confident individuals who are ready to lead fulfilling lives as valued members of society. Are they saying that pupils aren't currently leading fulfilling lives? Aren't they already valued members of society? You'll notice that they're all written kind of in a future tense. Pupils will be ready to be informed ethical citizens. So there's not even really a conceptualization of the child. Like, I love the new sociology of the child that Keynote did, where it's being and becoming. I think that was an elegant way to talk about how we should think about young people at school. Those kind of considerations aren't happening here. So much like achieve their full potential, the 4 Ps, the 4 purposes, they're vague, they're ambiguous, they're a bit woolly. They're helpful as, I think, as moving points on the horizon, that you can aim for that, but you might not get it. But there are more specific steps we need to look at along the way to keep us on track. So we can also have, on the other end of the spectrum, a very narrow purpose. If you look at, like, say, if you think your purpose is to help people learn, and you go by Ofsted's definition of what learning is, they summarized it mostly by just saying learning is a change in long-term memory. Now, if you've been a teacher, did you ever, like, wake up and go, I can't wait to change some long-term memory today? It just doesn't feel... So I think, we can go from one side of the spectrum to the other. Many of the teachers in Wales kind of accepted the 4 purposes, but they still are holding on to a superficial understanding, in my opinion, of the arguments made by different theorists and philosophers in education. So, for instance, we have a lot of talk about what should be in the curriculum right now because it's a large framework that will allow schools at a school level to develop what that curriculum will be for that school. And there's not any, there are no sacred cows right now. Everything's up for grabs. So a lot of teachers are arguing that they want core knowledge, that they want powerful knowledge. And they've read a bit by Hirsch, and they've bumped into some work from Jung. And they'll say, they've literally said to me, well, my lesson is this, this, and this. And this is where I introduce cultural capital to the pupils. And I'm like, well, what do you mean by cultural capital? And they're saying, well, the best stuff society has to offer. This is where we're looking at Macbeth. And so they've never read Bourdieu. They don't understand cultural capital in the way that he was talking about it. They don't bring into the conversation the idea of field or habitus or distinction or taste. And in fact, they don't even understand that Bourdieu was talking about the social reproduction element of schools. So here they are saying that they want to give young people cultural capital so they can have social mobility, when Bourdieu was largely making the argument that it was cultural capital that prohibited social mobility. With talking about aims and purposes, Nell Noddings wrote, well, she talks about there's a general reluctance to get involved in these kinds of discussions. And it's true, teaching is busy, it's difficult, there's a lot going on, and I remember as a teacher, I took my work home with me constantly. It's also very heavily regulated with accountability, and you've got to make opportunity costs. So you've got to think about opportunity costs and make economic choices about how you're going to spend your time. And is it worth your while to spend your time thinking philosophically about your aims and purposes, or should you just get on with marking? I think also as teacher educators, we can be over-reliant on the performative aspects of teacher practice, but the performative element is always intersected and informed by our values and beliefs about education, teaching, and learning. So one thing that I try to always do is not use the term teacher trainer. It really bothers me for some reason because I feel like it robs us a bit of what happens in our classrooms. Because remember, for me, training was different from schooling and different from education because it was focusing on a skill or a task. If I'm teaching someone how to sort something if I'm using Excel and I'm teaching them how to budget something in Excel, I'm teaching them I'm training them on a skill of budgeting and organizing. That could become educational if they use that idea of budgeting as kind of a worldview, as something that they could help interpret their social life through, like if they're trying to make decisions about how much time they should spend at school and spend with their friends, or maybe they're just talking about their friends and they should budget. I'm going to spend this much time with them. This person creates a toxic situation. Forget Becky. That kind of thing. That becomes more educated for me. So relying on symbolic concepts without requiring teachers to excavate their assumptions about knowledge, about humanity, about reality, about the ethics that inform their practice doesn't make sense to me. So if teachers are arguing about core or powerful knowledge, What do they believe about how we acquire knowledge? And what is their justification for that claim? If asked these teachers, what does it mean to be fully human, what could their response be? If they're presented between a choice between a whole language and phonics approach, are they understanding that largely that is an argument based on an ethical warrant rather than a decision about efficacy or efficiency? So these ideas, whether we actively consider them or not, inform our pedagogy. So Noddings talks that Ames' talk is to education what freedom is to democracy. Without freedom, democracy degenerates into a form quite different from what we call liberal democracy. Similarly, without continual reflective discussion of aims, education may become a poor substitute for its best vision. Just as freedom takes on newer and richer meanings as times change, so must the aims of education change. Even if they might be stated in fairly constant terms, the meaning of those words will take on new dimensions as conditions change. For example, if we look at what it means to be literate, it used to be pretty straightforward, but now we've got visual literacy, digital literacy, emotional literacy, consumer literacy, critical media literacy, but without reflecting about what we mean by literate and what the purpose of that literacy is, we can fail to comprehend the various forms of literacy that have developed over time. BESA writes also about purpose, and that our current age of education is dominated by measurement and comparisons of educational outcomes, and that these measurements seem to be the key players, the driving, the motivational factors in educational policy, and therefore, by extension, our educational practice. So if we think back to the data I discussed a few minutes ago, these claims gain further legitimacy. BESA argues the danger in this approach is we value what is measured rather than engaging measurement of what we value. It is the latter, however, our values, that ultimately inform our decisions about the aims and purposes of education and the methods we employ in pursuing those ends. He continues arguing that we should possibly consider what a good education looks like rather than an effective education. And in many ways, this dismantles the technical rationale that privileges efficiency over complexity, technical solutions rather than human endeavors. It also helps us to connect philosophically, thinking about aims and purposes in education to concepts that will improve our pedagogical practice. Now, what is the point then of talking about purpose? Well, I think there's a direct connection between purpose and efficacy. And there's a large body of research that talks about the impact that a teacher's efficacy can have, not only on themselves and on their colleagues, but particularly in learners. I mean, even John Hattie in his meta-analysis has recognized that teacher efficacy has a 1.53 effect size, which must be very impressive. So whether you ascribe to those or not, there's qualitative and quantitative research that suggests that efficacy is one of the most important things we can possess in education. So I think there is a relationship between purpose and efficacy. And so I'm going to delve very slightly into psychology. Dangerous waters when you got a psychologist can hear our back. So Viktor Frankl is an interesting character. I don't think I have a picture of him. He wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning, I think it was called, Man's Search for Meaning. And Frankl is a Holocaust survivor and a psychiatrist, and he came up with the concept of logotherapy. Now, his book is an account of his experience through the Second World War and through these concentration camps. There's quite a bit of controversy because there are people saying that he embellished his accounts, that he made it look like he was in Auschwitz for much longer than he actually was. I'm like, what's a day to, and you were there. But there are some other considerations. He was working for the Nazi Party prior to his internment. And, you have to know all factors of it. But the idea of logotherapy, I think, has a simple, elegant organizational factor that can help us understand then what the relationship to purpose might be. So his argument is basically that the primary factor, the motivating factor in humanity, so again, the kind of question of what does it mean to be fully human? He might answer, to be fully human is to find purpose in our lives, or to search for meaning in our lives. So he felt like that was our primary motive, and that was dependent upon two things, meaningfulness and significance. So the meaning is derived from our ability to recognize and appreciate aspects of our lives that have significance. But then, what is a significant aspect of our lives? Well, he was saying significance is developed through recognizing and reflecting on our actions and their impact. So I think of it, we could use the significance in research as a kind of a way to frame this a little more concretely. So we can say that the significance is the strength of the evidence that gives us confidence in whatever conclusion we might draw from our interactions or experiences. So then he puts out, and I'm reducing this down quite a bit, 3 kind of criteria for getting to this stage: engaging, encountering, and coping. Engaging is simply getting up and doing stuff. I mean, you've got to be out there doing things. So being involved, doing things, interacting with people, interacting with ideas. Encountering is when you are out and about and you're in the engagement stage and you're bumping into people and you're having that interaction, of course. And then coping is associated with resilience, it's associated with overcoming. Because this is an existentialist kind of theory, logotherapy is, of course, it's got to have suffering involved somehow. And so he said that his coping was specifically with coping with suffering. I take the suffering, it could be anything. It could be anything that causes us that kind of maybe cognitive dissonance or social discomfort, or when we're challenged with an idea personally or challenged by someone else, or, just any kind of a barrier. So now I'm going to move on to Bandura then. So talked about the concept of efficacy, which is the extent to which teachers believe they can affect pupils' learning. And there's different types of expectations, outcome expectations and efficacy expectations. When we talk about outcome expectations, that's the idea that a belief in the behavior will lead to certain results. And we can say that's a collective kind of efficacy. That we can believe that good teaching that's well planned and executed will lead to certain results. And then the efficacy expectation is the idea that I can do good teaching, for instance. Okay, so we can take the outcome expectations as kind of a normative teacher concept, or the efficacy as an individual. So he has 4 states then that bring us to this idea of an enhanced sense of efficacy. Some people argue for 5. The first one, mastery experiences, developing expertise, gathering knowledge, increasing skill, going out and doing stuff. Vicarious experiences, observations of others, hearing about others, being associated with others while they're doing things, especially those whom we consider role models. Then there's social persuasion. We've got kind of positive reward for the things that we do, when we do things and people respond to us and say, that was really great work, you did that well. It can even include critique, saying that was great work, and in order to get better. Basically, it is a positive reinforcement of the things we do. The affective states then is, what is our emotional state or physiological responses to growth experiences? They can be positive experiences, or they could be the coping experiences that we have as well. Now, Maddox suggests that part of these are all very real things, but that we can also have imaginal experiences where we're visualizing or imagining of success. So if we organize these states through Frankel's 3 criteria, and then focus specifically on philosophical engagements with our practice as teachers, so that we focus it right down to really where the rubber hits the road, we could say that engaging is getting teachers and anyone who's an educator involved in philosophical discussions and investigations of the philosophical and pedagogical values and beliefs that they hold. And then as they do that, they go out and they start sharing that with others, part of maybe as a school, as a learning organization, or through their professional development, or through their action research perhaps. They can develop those vicarious learning through the performance competence and social persuasion. All of that is through getting involved with those ideas, going to conferences, working in their classroom, just being cognizant of those environmental factors. And then, of course, the coping is when they're challenged with an idea. Maybe they've been brought up to consider phonics as the one true God, and all of a sudden someone talked to them about the whole language approach. How do they respond to that? How do they respond to that challenge? Are they able to overcome it? Are they relying on their pedagogical reasoning, their philosophical questioning? So that's how it could all fit together. So, in short, if again we could use, I'd like to use action research maybe or just any kind of research, as a kind of organization for this. So, if by thinking purposefully about what we're doing, following this model, and thinking about those states that Bandura talks about, we can see it's kind of a circuit. It doesn't matter where you hop onto the circuit, because they're so closely related that you can continue to follow that circuit as long as you're thoughtfully, purposefully doing it. So remember when BESA argued that we should think about the measurement of what we value? One way we could do that is through like the policies that are offered to us. So Wales right now, the Welsh government's developing a national strategy for evidence-informed practice. And there's a big debate about what do we mean by evidence-informed. And part of that debate that needs to be included is this idea that we should consider the values and beliefs that are involved in that research. So the Wales Centre for Public Policy, they were commissioned to do a report. They finished a report that said that they identified desired behaviors for engaging in evidence-informed practice, which include research literacy, adherence to best practice in national key areas, and a more reflective approach to action research and professional learning. So I'm arguing, perhaps, then what we could do is take this idea of how do we find meaning in evidence-informed practice by having a key understanding of how values and beliefs and meaning-making processes inform how we produce, interpret, and respond to the research evidence. So Ferrero addresses the difficulty of interpreting evidence into practice by saying, the point here is that translating research into practice is not as straightforward as we often pretend. While the research can usually tell us something useful about how to teach or how not to teach, it does so at a high level of abstraction. Furthermore, research tells us almost nothing about what to teach and why to teach it, because these aren't empirical questions, they're normative ones. Their answers derive from beliefs, value systems, and worldviews. BESA echoes these sentiments, saying the problem with interpreting research is the abundance of information about educational outcomes has given the impression that decisions about the direction of educational policy and the shape and form of educational practice can be based solely upon factual information. This isn't to say factual information is not important. Of course it is, but there are two challenges that complicate this approach. First, decisions about what ought to be done cannot be logically derived from what is, and this is the is-ought problem presented by Hume. As BESA explains it, it suggests when we're engaged in making decisions about educational outcomes, we are necessarily involved in value judgments about what is desirable. When interpreting the validity of our measurements, are we measuring what we value, what he calls normative validity, or are we measuring what we can easily measure, which is the technical validity, the rigor and the reliability of the measure itself? As Ball and others have written, in education, the means have become ends in themselves, and the indicators of quality have been mistaken for quality itself. In interpreting educational research without a philosophical consideration of our educational desires, the things in which we hope to achieve as we hope to fulfill a purpose, the normative validity of our educational concerns are replaced with a fetishized technical validity. Ferreira continues to emphasize the importance of values, stating between the science of learning and the practice of teaching lie important value judgments that color our reading of the research and the implications for the practice we derive from it. These value judgments are born from and exercised through ideological worldviews and philosophical considerations of education and research evidence. However, in order for these steps to produce efficacious effects, teachers must be practiced in the consideration of their own and others' values and beliefs. So I'm arguing today that we need a return to Ames talk, particularly in Wales right now where we've been given a framework. What happens is we were given the 4 purposes as a fait accompli, that these are decided and you must work with these. And then we were given 6 areas of learning and experience that we couldn't change. And then we were given what matter statements that were developed by pioneer schools without an explicit opportunity to think philosophically about the purposes and the aims and the means. The teachers in the pioneer schools had to orientate their deliberations towards the 4 purposes and not towards what it means individually. And even with educational research, which is meant to enhance teachers' practice, there's a danger that teachers are woefully unprepared to examine discourses of reliability, generalizability, and effect size. So they just simply take these as at face value, as truth, as empirical truth, without thinking about the values and beliefs that have propped them up. So when this happens, the constructs of these pieces of research threaten to stand as proxies for purpose. I presented evidence suggesting that this may already be happening. Phrases like helping pupils achieve their potential are meaningless slogans that potentially rob teachers of authentically engaging in a sense of purpose that can enhance their efficacy and positively impact their practice. The variations in between schools above and below the free school meal average in Wales suggest a number of variables that affect what teachers prioritize and why. But without dedicated time and place to purposefully question, challenge, and reflect upon what they believe about knowledge, about what it means to be human, or what it means to be ethical, there is a danger they will continue to operate under an insufficient philosophy, or unrealized potential, if you will, that undermines the efficacy of their practice and educational experiences they share with their pupils. Thank you.